Tisha B'av, the 9th day in the Jewish month of Av, is a day of mourning for the Jewish people, who grieve over the destruction of the two Jewish biblical temples. Perhaps the best place to understand the origins and traditions of this substantial date is the Old City of Jerusalem.
Behind me is Temple Mount, where the temple stood and where now famously Al-Aqsa Mosque stands, and where the Dome of the Rock is situated with the Golden Dome. And that is obviously a very important site because it represents for the Jewish people the destruction of the temple 2,000 years ago. But it also represents the hopes and dreams of our people of redemption in the future when, again, Jerusalem will be fully restored to its former grandeur. But I should say that the Temple Mount also represents tragedy even in our current environment.
Rabbi Kiermeyer, a former rabbi of the Fifth Avenue Synagogue in New York, who decided to immigrate to Israel several years ago, is very familiar with the Old City of Jerusalem and its connection to Jewish history. Rabbi Kiermeyer thinks that this year, Tisha B'av has a special meaning.
This year, interestingly, Tisha B'av, the fast of the 9th of Av, coincides with the Sabbath, which creates a very awkward situation because on the Sabbath we are filled with joy. And obviously the fast, with all of its mourning, is inconsistent with that message of the Sabbath, of Shabbat. And so what the sages determined is that on years such as this, the fast of Av is postponed until Sunday. So this year, we're not really even observing the fast on the 9th of Av, but really on the 10th of Av. And I think that this coincidence of the 9th of Av with the Shabbat is a perfect symbolic vantage point to appreciate that this day of mourning is different for our generation than it was for generations past. You see, we are now living not in a city that is filled with ruins, ashes, sadness, and destruction. We're living in a Jerusalem that has been reestablished, that is the thriving and exciting capital of Israel, filled with culture.
The Archeological Garden of Davidson Center brings us the most vivid evidence of the destruction of the Second Jewish Temple. Attached to the western wall, we can see rocks that were knocked from the wall of the Temple Mount by the Roman forces during the Great Jewish Revolt of the 1st century CE.
I think this is a reminder that Jerusalem is not fully rebuilt, that the world is still in need of redemption. There's a story that's told in the Talmud of a number of rabbinic sages who joined Rabbi Akiva as they approached Jerusalem during the years after the destruction of the temple. And all of the sages were crying except for Rabbi Akiva, who started to laugh. And they asked him, "Why are you laughing? We're looking at these stones. We are witnessing the destruction of the temple, the house of God." And Rabbi Akiva said, "I understand why you're crying, but that's why I'm laughing. You're crying because you see the destruction. But I am laughing," said Rabbi Akiva, "because just as now I look at these stones of destruction and I see fulfilled the words of the prophets who foretold this destruction, and I know that those prophecies came true. Now," said Rabbi Akiva, "I am confident that the prophecies of those same prophets that foretold redemption and peace and the restoration of goodness in the world, that those too will come true. And for that reason, when I see the destruction, I begin to laugh because I begin to dream and envision the redemption and the peace that will follow."
The story of redemption and construction continues to follow us as we walk through the narrow streets of the Old City of Jerusalem. It is also a reminder to the delicate and fragile balance in this seam zone, less than a square kilometer in size, but full of tension and controversy. This house, for example, called the Rand House, is now home to 3 Muslim families. For Rabbi Kiermeyer, this place is significant because of its famous former resident, Jewish investor Menachem Mendel Rand.
The Rand home has a very special feature. Beneath the house is a wine cistern. And that was very important to Menachem Mendel Rand because he was concerned that when the Messiah comes and the temple is rebuilt, that there would be a panicked rush to arrive at the temple site. And he wanted to be able to avoid all of the masses. He was worried that he might get injured on the way to the Temple Mount and not be able to perform the service. And he figured that if he had this house with a tunnel that reaches underneath the house and continues all the way to the Western Wall, he would have an unobstructed path to reach the Temple Mount when the Messiah arrives, in order so that he could be one of the first to start offering sacrifices and partake in the service in the temple. And so this home of Menachem Mendel Rand is a symbol of the yearning for Zion, in that Menachem Mendel Rand himself moved to Israel in a time when it was very difficult to do so, in 1901. But it's also a symbol of this yearning for redemption here in Jerusalem. Already then, he was planning for how he would partake in the rebuilt temple and how he could be a part of its renewed service.
Another place which may be a good example of the Jewish recovery after years of devastation is the Hurva synagogue. Hurva, ruin in Hebrew, was the name given to this house of prayer, which was destroyed several times but was reconstructed in recent decades.
Students of the famous sage Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, Rabbi Judah the Pious, came here in the early 18th century and built this synagogue, only to see it destroyed a few years later by Arab neighbors. And the synagogue lay in ruins for 140 years until it was rebuilt in the 1860s. And it was named the Beis Yaakov Synagogue, literally the House of Jacob Synagogue. But even after it received that name, the Jews in the area continued to call it the Hurva Synagogue, the place of destruction. It stood here until 1948, the War of Independence here in Israel, when the Israeli army was forced to retreat from this area, and the area was seized by the Jordanians. And the truth is, it has become a symbol of Jewish revival here in Israel, because even though this synagogue went through various stages in its complicated history, it is now in the most beautiful and exquisite state that it ever was.
Destruction and rejuvenation, the story of Tisha B'av, may represent for some the cycle of life. It is also the story of the Jewish people who have managed to survive and even to grow after so many catastrophes. And it is the story of Jerusalem, from its establishment to its glorious times, its destruction and rebuilding, to the hope it captures in so many people's hearts.